Hey, y'all, welcome back. So lectures on Lacan, we're working through seminar 14 on the logic of fantasy. This is our second session. And per usual, we want to start with a bit of review, just to give everybody a sense of where we went and perhaps kind of allude to where we're going to be headed today. So first and foremost, that review. Last time in our first session on this wild, weird seminar, into which were about 135 pages or so, we started by marking three structural lacks at the center of Lacan's middle thought. And some folks have been cracking up about my use of Lacan's early, middle, and later thought, like it's kind of like not a real thing, but it is a real thing. In fact, what I would suggest is that of all the thinkers that I've studied, taught, and so forth, Lacan is one of the most organic conceptual thinkers. His stuff is always on the move. His concepts are always evolving. Just look at objet A, look at that little a and the meaning it has had. Look at fantasy and the meaning it has had from its imaginary to symbolic to potentially real components. A lot of Lacan's terms, jouissance is another one. There are many paradigms of jouissance in Lacan. So it's not impossible to mark out this guy's middle thought. And by middle thought here, I usually pin it to his early to mid 1960s thinking. And I don't know what's up with the 60s, but whatever's happening in the 60s in jazz and analysis alike is phenomenally good. I really like what Lacan is doing, basically from seminar 11 forward. And thereabouts, like early 60s stuff. The three structural lacks that we marked in his middle thought were one, sexuation with regard to the living organism. And again, we talked a lot about this in our last series on the drive, which you can access, and our last series on seminar 11, which you can also access. The second great structural lack that Lacan's working through in his middle thought is alienation, particularly with regard to the split subject. But as you can see in 14, he's focused less on the split subject vis-a-vis alienation and more on the barred other as also subject to the defiling effects of the signifier, as we'll talk about. The third structural lack that we worked through last time was separation. Here in Lacan's middle thought is going to be referring more to what we do with the barred other. So sexuation with regard to the living organism, alienation with regard to the split subject, and separation with regard to the barred other. And as we saw last time, the split subject and the barred other in their lacks become superimposed at some level in this experience of separation, Lacan tells us toward the end of seminar 11. All of this brought us to the start of the logic of fantasy, where the opening theme is this: the structural logic of the barred other. Now, I'm not saying the seminar should have been called the logic of the other, the logic of the barred other, or the structural logic. Fantasy is still squarely on the horizon here. And I think in the materials for today, we'll be able to see again kind of how he's working his way towards the topic. But at the start of 14, the big theme is the structural logic of the barred other. Emphasis on structure and logic here. So we also had some bumper stickers that we've all heard before, but that point to this issue of the structural lack in the big other. Why is there no other of the other? For the same reason that there's no meta language. And here it is simply: because containers cannot be among their contents. At a simple level, foundational level, a basic level, this is what Lacan is working with here. It's a structural logic of container and thing contained. And if you're a reader of the 20th century literary critic and second greatest reader of Freud, in my view, Kenneth Burke, you know exactly what's up with container and thing contained. But Lacan is here discovering it through set theory and symbolic logic. Containers cannot be among their contents. A bag of dicks is not included in the dicks that are the contents of this bag. This is especially true when containers attempt to contain, encompass, and account for everything, as we suppose the big other, the state, the symbolic, to do, or at least to attempt to do. Emphasis here on the word suppose. Part of the fundamental fantasy that we suffer from on a regular basis is this supposition that indeed the big other is full, complete, and can actually achieve this objective of encompassing and accounting for everything. Every word in the language is included in the language, we often believe. So call it what you will, the symbolic, the state, the law, big brother, the big other, the Queen of England, RIP. All of these entities purport to encompass and contain an everything of sorts. And again, this is part of our fundamental fantasy. We assume, and I would argue delusionally so, not just fantastically, but often delusionally so, that the big other, big brother, the Queen of England, Colonel Sanders, aliens, etc., you start getting into psychotic categories of the huge imaginary other. I don't want to go that far with this, but I do want to suggest that part of the fundamental fantasy is this delusion that the big other is whole, complete, full, not suffering from lack like us, but instead in touch with plenitude, with fullness. We assume that the big other is able to do that. And that's one of the great aspects of the fundamental fantasy, as we discussed in our last series, but also as we're starting to realize here, as Lacan gets into this other fact, which is that beyond the fundamental fantasy is the truth of the big other, which is that it is divided, finite, and incomplete, just like us. That's partly where we're headed today. Let's get at this again, this logic that Lacan is developing around the barred other. Every totalizing effort, every operative effort toward unity, completion, oneness, every effort towards making a group of entities, a pile of entities, count as one, as a pile, as a group, cannot help but yield an additional one. And this is the important first move Lacan's making here. A one too many, an apparently extra, but in fact extimate un. The UN here is very important in French, German, and English alike. The one that is a non of some kind. And this additional one that is a non of some kind must be added to, and thus uncountable within the totalizing, supposedly closed count that it eludes, designates, and believe it or not, conditions. And that's the really important part here. This additional one, this one too many, is something in addition to the supposedly totalizing count that the symbolic, the big other, and the like purports to maintain. But here's the thing. This additional one eludes that count. It is uncountable within the register of the symbolic, within the register of the other. This additional one also designates that count. And at the same time, this is the very important part that Lacan has yet to spell out for us. This additional one, this one too many, is the condition of possibility for the big other's totalizing effort. And that's very important here. It doesn't just elude and designate this totalizing effort. It actually conditions it. Without that extimate relation to an additional one that can't be counted, the logic of the symbolic, in Badiou's terms, the state, the big other, starts to fall apart. And so does our fundamental fantasy about it. At issue here is effectively a plus one that relative to the other's totalizing count can only be understood as a negative one. And that's important here as well. It's a plus one that when viewed from the vantage point of the symbolic, of society, looks like a negative one. It's an addition that looks like a subtraction. The algebraic symbol for this -1, this un, un, in French, English, and German alike, is -phi. It's the symbol of castration that we oftentimes see in Lacan's thought. -phi in parens. This symbol of castration is one way that we've captured this -1 in Lacan's thought, which again is precisely the fundamental fantasy, the fantasy that the other isn't desirous but demanding. And this fantasy defends against the fact that, here it is, the other is castrated like us, suffers the effects of a -1, of a subtraction that marks some sort of an addition to whatever it is it thinks about itself. This is the key point Lacan is driving at. The other is castrated just like us, lacking just like us, incomplete just like us. And throughout these materials, the other in question is a capital O other. We're not talking about little imaginary others here. We're talking about the capital O other. Whatever Lacan is doing here with the capital O other, his point he's making is that it's barred just like us. Always, already, necessarily, nothing except barred. And the structural logic of the barred other is what he's trying to explain to us. Why, structurally speaking, the big other is always barred and lacking. This fact of fallenness and finitude at the level of the other and its relation to the subject, because we're bound up together with these two lacks, is where we're headed today. That's what we're going to try and scare out. This is why I said, in direct correspondence with Seminar 14, that the cause of this additional one, this one too many, for the other to handle, this one too many beyond the other's capacity to count, is fundamentally at root the unary trait. Again, with an emphasis on the un, the un, in unary trait. It's a common concept that pops up in Lacan. It's the primordial signifier. The unary trait, remember that un on the front, is a -1, symbolized often by the no of the father. This first dimension of what Lacan refers to as the name of the father, logic of prohibition, of no, is what we're after here with the unary trait. The first signifier, the primordial signifier, the first unary stroke in the subject's life is that of prohibition, which is why the first signifier, I say, whether it was indeed literally that for you, it was effectively for all of us, no. Whatever your first word was that you heard, that you understood, that you uttered, whatever, it was effectively a no or a response to it. We know what the effect of this primordial signifier, this unary trait, is on the living subject. It is an incision, here marked by the -phi, that opens up a space, in Lacanian terms, symbolized by objet a, where I am not. The effect of this unary trait is to incise and open up. The incision that is -phi, that is castration, opens up a space symbolized by objet a, where I am not. And I'm using that phrase, I am not, directly from what Lacan is doing here at the start of Seminar 14, roughly the first third of it so far. This phrase, I am not, which is going to help him try to explain what he's doing with alienation in 14 that he hadn't already done with it in 11. This I am not, where I exist as something which, relative to the other's supposed claim to account for everything, can only be experienced as nothing. I'm a something that from the vantage point of the other's attempt to account for everything looks a hell of a lot like nothing. Something, everything, nothing. These are the pistons of this logic that Lacan is working through here. We can only experience ourselves as this nothing, because experience, of course, is mediated through the symbolic, and from the symbolic's vantage point, this something that we are when we are not looks a hell of a lot like nothing. In other words, as a not thing, as a no thing, an effect of prohibition, as a something which is nothing, but that also signifies the other's lack. This is the important additional turn. A something which is nothing that also marks a lack in the big other. The fact that the big other, like the Lacanian subject, is necessarily, logically, and structurally barred. Because in order for its totalizing count of everything to hold, nothing has to be left out. Nothing can be excluded from that totalizing count. Nothing has to be left behind. And because nothing is left behind, the totalizing count is incomplete. It just so happens that this nothing that is left behind, whatever else it involves, marks the place where I am not. So let's start here with this I am not and what we know about the Lacanian subject, because that's going to help us understand the Lacanian other that he's now telling us is equally barred. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. It's a saying I'm sure you've heard before. And the crucial point in bringing it up here, just as Lacan repeatedly does throughout the first third of Seminar 14, is just that. It's a saying, something said, something articulated, embodied in speech and writing alike, using language, namely mediated through the symbolic. Cogito ergo sum is a saying. And yet it's precisely this linguistic embodiment, this mediation through the symbolic, that this famous Cartesian bumper sticker also obscures. Cartesian here means that it comes from the thought of René Descartes. I think, therefore I am. Famous modern philosopher. How does this happen? How does this saying, cogito ergo sum, obscure, suppress, subordinate the language and the symbolic code on which it relies? Simply by conflating thinking with being, effectively mistaking the life of the mind for living organismic life, as though thinking were the same as being. I think, therefore I am. Thought, being, thinking, and being. This conflation for Lacan is highly problematic, and it's one of the ways that you see his genius at work. Geniuses come in all kinds, but there's a predominant twofold to their structure. Genius is usually somebody that's going to show up and show you how two things that everybody else at the present thinks are disparate, cell phones and taxi cabs, actually can work very well together. They see similarity and correspondence where others see difference and disparity. Hence Lyft, hence Uber, hence all the ride-hailing apps you can think of. A smartphone mixed with a taxi cab, turns out those two go really well together. The other type, though, that's predominant is folks who see difference where others only see similarity. Hannah Arendt is a great example of this, Heidegger's foremost student. She is exceptionally good at seeing differences where other people see equivalences. In Arendt's thought, thinking is not willing, is not judging. The life of the mind is structured atop these three very distinct faculties that everybody thinks is the same. Lacan often moves in very much the same way. Need is not demand, is not desire, is not drive. They're connected through a logic that we've developed in this series, but they are fundamentally distinct registers of human experience. But for most folks, a need is the same as a demand, it's the same as a desire. Think about the way that sexuality, for instance, is mediated through rhetorics of need, when in fact it's occurring at the level of desire, which in fact, if you push sexuality hard enough, isn't about desire at all. Here's why it's important, this phrase, cogito ergo sum, for Lacan, and why what he wants to show is that it conflates thinking and being. And what Lacan wants to do is pull those two apart and say, thinking is not being. And he wants to talk about the differential relation between these two elements that, according to Descartes, are effectively the same. The fact that I'm thinking is proof that I exist. There's this equivalence between thinking and being that Lacan thinks is complete bullshit. And he's correct. But nevertheless, that bullshit was essential for the intellectual history and development of psychoanalysis. This is why Lacan says, no Descartes, no Freud. If there was no delusion of a transparent, transcendental consciousness, which is what Descartes was getting after here, there would be no discovery of the unconscious in all of its meontological glory. And when I say meontological, remember what I mean here from the Greek meon, meaning non-being. Psychoanalysis doesn't have an ontology because it's not about being. It has a meontology, you've often heard me say, because it traces better than any tradition the fundamental root non-being at the core of humankind. That's why its ontology is a meontology. And this is out of Lacan. I'm not just making this up. You can find this in his work where he uses and toys with the Greek meon to try and capture this sense in which psychoanalysis deals with a non-being. And in this first third of the seminar, when he starts getting into repetition, when he starts getting into, the logic from repression to repetition to retroaction in the first third of the seminar, 14, is very much indebted to what he's doing with non-being and the meontological status of psychoanalytic theory and technique. But the point here is that cogito ergo sum matters because the confusion that it embraces of thinking and being was precisely the confusion that psychoanalysis could dispel via Freud, according to Lacan, of course, by separating thinking from being, thought from existence. And principally, this is also the reason why Lacan focuses his discussion of alienation, which is the substance so far of Seminar 14, around this naughty phrase. And I want you to hear naughty in every sense of the word. A knot of wood, a knot that is not, and then, of course, the most likely one, which is naughty as in very bad. Here's that naughty phrase that you hear over and over again at the start of Seminar 14, and it's the one we're going to just unpack, get it out of the way, and move on from. Either I do not think or I am not. Lacan keeps returning to this phrase in 14. Either I do not think or I am not. So you see why alienation is the term he's using here, because this is an either or. It's a veil again. Either I do not think or I am not. Something about this for him is crucial. Let's see if we can make sense of it. Now, as always, with making sense, it seems, with things in Lacan, just like last time in our first session on 14, we spent a lot of time reading 11 to get us ramped up to 14. In order to understand this particular part of 14, where he's talking about this either or, either I do not think or I am not. In order to understand this, it's important to actually take another step back, a little further back this time. from 67 to 57, 10 years prior, when Lacan is writing The Agency, or as the wondrous, ever wondrous Bruce Fink puts it, The Instance of the Letter in the Unconscious. It's an essay in a Cree, starts about in the 400s. You can check it out. But that's where Lacan's thinking on this particular alienation and the Cartesian cogito ergo sum really finds its most profound pronouncements 10 years prior to what he's doing here in 14. So let's take a look. And we'll do this as efficiently as possible, with the idea being that you can always go back and read the essay and check the passages. Once more, in the instance of the letter in the unconscious, Descartes' wager comes up. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. In the cogito part, you see this transparent, supposedly transcendental subject. And then in the sum, therefore I am, you see an existential affirmation of that translucent subject. Here's Lacan's argument against and around this Cartesian bumper sticker. To address this phrase to someone, cogito ergo sum, and don't forget, it's a phrase, it's a saying. Descartes addressed that shit to his readership, is to constitute oneself as a grammatical subject in Lacanian terms. And if you want to know what grammatical subject means, this is from his essay, Subversion of the Subject, Dialectic of Desire. You can check out our podcast episodes where we spend a lot of time teasing out the distinction between the enunciating subject and the grammatical subject. The grammatical subject, in brief, is how you appear in language when you talk about yourself. There's the you that's speaking, that's the enunciating subject, and then there's the you that is figured in spoken discourse. And you can see why this is important for analytic experience. The analysand shows up and has a lot to say about themselves. Well, Lacan's point is that there are always two subjects at play in moments like this. There's the you of which you're speaking, which may often be the you that is not the you of which you're speaking. And this is the essay where he tries to tease this out. And then you have to also factor in how the analyst plays a part in all of this. So you've got this elaborate intersubjective structure occurring in analytic experience. What Lacan wants to do with the grammatical subject is separate it from the embodied speaking being that is constantly producing it at the level of their discourse about themselves. And he wants to say that this cogito ergo sum stumbles in to a lot of the same ego speak that we see in analytic experience. Because what happens when you tell somebody, I think, therefore I am, is that you constitute yourself in speech. You are now a being in language and as language. And in this sense, you are less a thinking subject, a cogitans, if you like your Latin, than an object of your own thought, a cogitatum. And by extension, somebody else's thought too. So note the shift here. When I tell you, I think, therefore I am, I'm less a thinking subject in that moment than an object for both of us to consider. That's important here. I'm not a subject when I talk about myself. In fact, I'm quite more directly an object. What happens here is that it limits my existence, my being there in my being, to self-consciousness, to my ability to think and think about and talk about myself, namely to my status as an ego. That's the real dilemma here. I think, therefore I am. It limits existence, the being there in my being and all this business, to self-consciousness, to effectively ego. And as we know in psychoanalysis, that is ultimately a trap, even if it is an important one to step through on your way somewhere else. Here, the enunciating subject, the subject of the signifier, embodied subject on the side of being, is subordinate to and suppressed by the grammatical subject, the subject of the signified. which is this subject in the field of language, in the field of not being, but meaning. In many ways, this is the Lacanian subject. The split subject is a subject split between its status as an enunciating, embodied speaker with impulses and the like, and a grammatical, figured in discourse entity, an object, that is also shot through with impulses, not least of which is the desire for your approval and recognition. Because if I didn't have that desire, I wouldn't be addressing this speech to you in hopes that you would sign off on the fact and say, oh, you know what? You are indeed a thinking being. Gee whiz, thanks for that. I get it now. Boy, you really are that one. If I were certain that I was, I wouldn't need your stamp of approval. The challenge here becomes, and this is Lacan, whether I speak of myself in a way that conforms to what I am. This is the real challenge in Lacan's essay in 1957. There's a lot in there on language, but around the discussion of the unconscious, the agency of the letter in the unconscious, this is the key theme. When I speak about myself, does that speech conform to what I am? The challenge is to know whether I speak of myself in a way that conforms to what I am. This challenge, though, is false. This attempt, this struggle to constantly speak what you are, is a dead end, a red herring, because it presumes a correspondence theory of the subject, where there's what I say over here and what I am over here, and the goal is to make them equivalent, to equate them. And Lacan's like, that's not really what we're after here. But notice also that we are not just talking about Lacanian psychoanalysis here. Isn't this also the primary piston of today's identity politics? I show up and tell you my pronouns. And that assumes that I'm able to put into speech exactly what I am. That assumes that I can make my speaking correspond directly with my being. Maybe the correct way to respond to the demand that we announce our pronouns is just to say, I don't know, or to say I'm unable. But that's precisely what's happening here. This struggle to find a correspondence, an equivalence, mathematical and otherwise, to speech and being. This challenge is false. And so is all of the white-faced, mush-minded, techno-liberal hand-wringing that it produces, particularly among educated elites in the West. And it distracts us, I would offer, from another, more properly Lacanian challenge. And here it is. When I talk about myself, am I the same as the self of whom I speak? Or to put it in the Cartesian side, when I think about myself, am I the same as the self of whom I think? In short, the answer is no, which begs the question, why not? Behind all the professed self-certainties of the ego, we know, is this fundamental field of uncertainty. This is well developed in Lacan's 50s thought, particularly in the Function and the Field essay. You see a lot of terrific work in there on developing and revealing behind the ego the fundamental uncertainties that prop it up, that it continually resists. Which is exactly why, of course, I am always addressing my self-certainties to you, to an audience. Why self-certainty is always addressed to others, because I need your endorsement, your guarantee, your recognition. It's the sure sign that I am not certain when I start addressing my supposed certainties to you. This is all Lacan's ego theory in the 50s. You can get this all over the place, but the function in the field essay is really where it starts popping, I think. At stake in all of this is the basic vel, this either or of alienation. On the one side, there is being, and on the other side, there is meaning. And it might be useful at this point to just pause and get out some diagrams and start drawing some of this stuff. The diagram is simple, but I think it's helpful to actually have it before you to see. So I'm going to start sharing my screen here. And as always, bring us up to this whiteboard here. All right, thumbs up if you can see what we have in front of us now. All right, thank you. So the obvious part that's going to be happening here is famous diagrams in Lacan's thought here. These are two of them. And what we'll do is make it a little bigger so there's some more room over here. On one side, you have being. Here is usually where you see the subject. And on the other, you have meaning. Here is where you see the other. Note, I'm writing it as a barred other. We have yet to defend that claim beyond the structural logic of container and thing contained, but suffice it to say that's where it goes. On the left, you see the field of the subject. On the right, you see the field of the big other. Okay, on this left-hand side, what you see is an I that is unconscious, that is also related to the enunciating subject, which I write as E.S because I also want to flag, as Lacan cleverly does, the correspondence between enunciating subject and empty set. On the other side, you see a different I. The I that shows up in the field of the big other is the I that corresponds to the ego. Here's your grammatical subject. Here's your Cartesian subject. Here is also that delusional cogitans, that thinking being, is out here in the field of meaning. And you've got these two choices, these two options as to where you want to be. For us, in understanding what Lacan is doing here against Descartes in his 1957 essay on the instance, what we have are a couple of key phrases. And if you want to read along with this, they're on page 430 of EURIAS. And we'll pause for a second so you can grab the book, as I just did. We're talking about the standard English translation of EURIAS. We're on page 430. And we're toward the bottom of page 430 in the second to the last full paragraph. That is, it wasn't going very far, is how it begins. And then Lacan gives us a phrase toward the bottom of 430. I am thinking where I am not. Therefore, I am where I'm not thinking. Now, he is clearly messing with the Cartesian, I think, therefore I am. And he's saying, I am thinking where I'm not. Therefore, I am where I'm not thinking. This is his first turn of two out of the Cartesian cogito ergo sum. Now, what I want to do is I want to read this sentence again, but I'm going to add the two different I's so that you know what he's talking about a little more clearly here. I am thinking as subject of the unconscious, as unconscious, where I, as an ego, am not. Therefore, I am as an unconscious subject, where I, as an ego, am not thinking. So you see the slip here, right? Is you have to understand that when Lacan is using the vertical pronoun I here, he's messing with two different senses. On the one hand, you've got the je, you've got the sub, which he often uses for the subject, and then you've got the moi, what he often uses for the ego. He's having both of them at play here. The je and the ich, if you want to have your German going here at the same time. So here it is again. I am thinking as unconscious, where I as ego am not. Therefore, I am as unconscious, where I as ego am not thinking. That's how you want to read what he's doing on 430. And remember, what we're up to here is trying to understand this key move he's making again and again and again in seminar 14. All right, now on 430, go down a few more lines to the second turn out of and against Descartes that Lacan comes up with here. The paragraph begins, what we must say is, and here Lacan tries to give it to us as directly as possible. I am not where I am the plaything of my thought. I think about what I am, where I do not think I am thinking. Now, this is fundamental here. And again, we can add the two different types of subjectivity, enunciating and grammatical, that he's playing with here. I'll add them, and you can read along and figure it with me as well. I, as unconscious, am not, where I, as ego, am the plaything of my thought. I, again, as unconscious, think about what I am. And here he means as an unconscious subject, as an enunciating subject, and also as an ego, as a grammatical subject. I, as unconscious, think about what I am, as unconscious and ego, where I, as ego, do not think I am thinking. So part of the reason why these phrases are difficult is that Lacan is toying with two understandings of the vertical pronoun I. One refers to an enunciating subject, which occupies, thanks to the big other, the field of the unconscious, and the other as ego, which also, thanks to the efforts of the big other, becomes a grammatical subject. And that's how we read these key bumper stickers in the instance of the letter in the unconscious, 10 years before Lacan is working on this other stuff. The key point here, again, is you have to hold both meanings of I in mind as you read this account. And the same is true of Lacan's use of I in seminar 14 on the logic of fantasy. I can mean ego, a la Freud's Ich, but again, it can also mean subject, a la Lacan's je, which is distinct from his term for ego, moi, right? I, though, is how we get it. Now, I'm not saying that if you go back to the French, you're going to see all these distinctions. Oftentimes, that's not the case. But conceptually, this is a way to understand what Lacan is doing here with these phrases. Which brings us to the big one in 14, the one that he keeps coming back to for reasons that I hope will become apparent. Either I do not think, or I am not. Once again, there's a reason why this is called the logic of fantasy. Either I do not think, or I am not. Were we to continue with our mapping here, what you would have here is I am not, and I do not think. Either I do not think, or I am not. Here's that either or again. All right, first and foremost, I do not think. Let's start with this one. The reason why we can say you're not thinking when you are operating as a grammatical subject in the field of the big other is because, according to Lacan, all true thoughts are unconscious thoughts. Thinking is most profound when it is separated from consciousness. True thoughts are unconscious thoughts, not waking, self-aware, conscious thoughts. The ego, in other words, it thinks it's thinking, but its self-consciousness is in fact false consciousness. That's important, and it's an easy way to understand what he's saying. I do not think in the field of the big other. The reason why we don't think in the field of the big other is because everything that passes for thought in that experience is false. True thought is unconscious. Self-consciousness in the field of the ego, as conditioned by that of the big other, is in fact false consciousness. That's why you're not thinking out here, because what passes for thought is a bunch of bullshit. It's called ideology. Which brings us to this I am not. Because the I, as coherent, unified, transparent, translucent, transcendent self, is revealed to be a mirage in and by the unconscious. The I that is not here is the I that thinks it's thinking in the field of the big other. The ego is revealed to be a mirage out here in the field of being. The Cartesian subject as a unified self is revealed as a mirage by the experience of the unconscious. So part of what's happening here is the I that is not is the ego that falls apart in the field of the unconscious. That's one way to understand this. Let's add a couple more. From the vantage point of meaning of the big other, of the symbolic, the grammatical subject, the ego, there's nothing out here. And certainly no elements of oneself as an egocentric, self-conscious cogitans. That's one way to understand this I am not. I am not an ego here. That's what we have. The I am not says, I am not an ego in the field of being. But it's not the most profound way to understand what Lacan's doing here with I am not. One turn better. I am as a not out here in the field of being. So it's not just that the ego doesn't exist. It's that my sense of self, if you could have it as that, out here is that of a not. I equal something that is not. I'm a not. Non-being, existence as a not, as we know, is a function of the no, is an effect of the signifier. And this is precisely the position of the unconscious, as well as its meontology. That's also, and more profoundly, what is at stake in the I am not. It's a way of being as nothing, as a not thing, which of course marks the fact that we are subject to and an effect of this no thing that is the name of the Father. Happy to unpack all this, but if you've seen the previous lectures in this series, you know exactly what we're getting at here. So on the one hand, you could read this as, I am not an ego out here in the field of being, the way I am over here in the field of meaning. But the other way is, I am a not out here. In other words, the field of being that we are dealing with here is in fact a field of non-being. And psychoanalysis is profound because it is the greatest tradition for thinking this non-being. That's the important part here. The reason why I've got it barred or marked out is to indicate this. And the reason why I always say that psychoanalysis is a science, but it deals not with objectivity, but instead objectality, not things, but openings, not quids, but causes, is because the field of non-being is a field of openings, not entities, not objects to be studied, but openings to be traced. And psychoanalysis does a very good job in the Lacanian tradition of tracing those openings, the opening that is the unconscious, which is, oddly enough, the primary object that Freud discovered. Freud's great discovery was an object for psychoanalytic theory and technique that was in fact not an object at all, but an opening. This is how Lacan reads it and how I encourage you to as well. So here's the deal. What the fuck does all this have to do with fantasy? Why are we in the nosebleed heights of Cartesian thought and this logical game Lacan is playing around the ego and the unconscious in a seminar that's supposed to be about fantasy? Well, check it out. He realizes at some level that his audience is wondering about this, which is in part why on page 91 to 92 of this seminar, of the unofficial, unpublished, though readily available English translation of this seminar, you get him trying to spell it out. He's absolutely trying to spell out what he's doing here and how this helps with the logic of fantasy. First paragraph is about the logic of fantasy. And then he wants to show how alienation is important because that's the foundation for this logic of fantasy. But in order to understand alienation, he goes on to say, you also have to understand the unconscious because that's the truth of alienation. This is kind of where we are right now. Now, what you also have to do if you want to understand the unconscious is understand what Lacan is doing with objet A, because that is what supports the truth of the unconscious. That is the truth of alienation. That is the foundation for the logic of fantasy. Page 91, he's trying to explain all this. But here's the deal. If you want to understand objet A, you have to understand castration. That's why he shifts to castration right here in the middle of page 91. And not just the castration of the subject, but the castration of the big other. And that's the big wager here. Toward the bottom of 91, he starts turning away from the castration of the split subject and towards that of the big other, here figured as the mother. And then from there, it's on to sexuality and right back to the topic of fantasy. 91 to 92 is fabulous for this stuff. And I would suggest we could make some good progress by just reading those couple pages. So with that, I want to pause, take a break, 10 minutes, take a look at pages 91 to 92. You get 90 pages into this seminar before Lacan tries to show up and tell you what the fuck he's talking about. It's not the best account of what's occurring, but I would submit that it proceeds just as I was telling you, from fantasy all the way through to sexuality. Those 2 pages, they're not fire, but they're a pretty good indication of how he is seeing all of these concepts lining up. So let's take 10, come back at 11:16, and we'll pick up where we left off and shift to, I think, the more profound stuff that's occurring in the first third of this seminar, which is around repetition, from repression to repetition to retroaction. The triple R's that take place in the first third of this seminar are really important to understanding what Lacan is up to with the one, which I would still submit as the centerpiece, conceptually speaking, of what he's doing. But start with 91, 92, see if you can get your bearings, come back in 10 minutes, and we'll pick up there, in addition to having some questions. Thanks. All right, welcome back. We have asked the basic question here, what the hell does all this have to do with fantasy? And in the break, in the conversation that erupted between the illustrious group that is here, tiny and forceful, What we came up with was some pages where Lacan is trying to explain to everybody what the hell he's up to. If you've got this unofficial English translation linked up to via our Substack, the page in question would be 91, and it would go really until 92. But if you've got a different translation or you're reading from the French, we're talking about the lecture Lacan gives in Seminar 14 on January 25th, 1967. It's a really terrific summary of what he's up to here. And we've been talking about it, but I want to make sure that it's also here in this recording so that you, dear viewer, dear listener, can track this page down and read it for yourself. In brief, what you'll see when you read these opening remarks from January 25th, 1967, is Lacan basically saying, hey, y'all, you've attended 9 lectures so far in this new 1966-1967 series on the logic of fantasy. But damn, you heard a lot of logic, but you're probably wondering, where's the fantasy in all this? And so he starts here in this lecture from the 25th of January, 1967, this 9th lecture in the seminar on the logic of fantasy, by saying, look, we are still on the trail of the logic of fantasy. We've been talking about alienation because it's the foundation of the logic of fantasy. And now we've shifted to talking about the unconscious because it gives the truth of alienation. But in order to understand the unconscious as the truth of alienation, that is the foundation for the logic of fantasy, he says, you also got to know a little something about objet A, this little o object we see in this English translation. How this objet A supports the truth of the unconscious, which supports the truth of alienation, which undergirds the logic of fantasy. So what Lacan is trying to do here is take you through the foundation, the layers that he's been trying to work us on. But here's the deal. As you maybe have seen in our lectures on Seminar 10 and Seminar 11, in order to understand objet A, you have to understand castration, the minus phi that is the incision that produces the opening designated by the algebraic symbol A, little a, italicized A, objet A. Which is why in the very next paragraph on page 91 here, Lacan shifts from this object cause of desire little a back to castration, marked of course by the minus phi. And then he wants to talk about 2 types of castration. There's the castration that we usually discuss around the Lacanian subject, the split subject. Here though, the great breakthrough is Lacan is saying that the big other is also subject to the same defiles of the signifier and is thus just as castrated as the subject. And he wants to go even further than that. He wants to say, and here we're just working on this lecture, he wants to say that if you push hard enough on castration, what you realize is that in the imaginary pre-Oedipal triangle between the child, the maternal figure, and the imaginary object known as the phallus, there's the horrific encounter of a big other that he says, a big other that is inaugural to the lived experience of the life of the child, namely the maternal figure, that is itself barred. The first big other in the child's life is whatever individual is figured as the maternal function. And what Lacan says is the first barred big other that the child encounters, horrifically, mind you, is this individual. And isn't that precisely what the pre-Oedipal imaginary triangle that we've worked on before illustrates? In order to secure the mother's desire for the child imagines the mother's desire for other things. In other words, to satisfy the child's desire for the mother, coming at this from a different angle, the child imagines, fantasizes even, about the desire of the mother for other stuff. Desire for becomes desire of. And this other stuff here represented by the phallus or the imaginary object, is a proto-symbol because it symbolizes the child's imagination of what mommy wants other than me that she currently doesn't have. If this is correct, it means that mommy is desirous. It means that mommy is not just the big other with all the answers and all the food and all the power in my life. It means that mommy is a big other that is in fact barred, split, lacking, and thus desirous. She doesn't have everything she wants. And this is horrific for the child, which is partly why the paternal function is so damn important here. As we have seen in previous series, I'm not going to rehearse the whole thing, we just don't have time to do it today. The paternal function is to cut in in a way that negates this imaginary object, hence minus phi as the symbol of castration here, and effectively says to the child, mommy doesn't have, and you cannot be this imaginary object. She doesn't have the phallus, and you can't be it for her. And what a relief. Mommy's desire is now subordinate to, substituted for the no, the prohibition, the non of the father. That's what's up with the first stage of the name of the father. It's the no of the father. And what that no, that prohibition cuts in to say is, mommy doesn't have the phallus and you can't be it for her. And this is a good thing for the child because it gives them some breathing room. It's the pin, according to Lacan, the rolling pin that is wedged into the back of the jaws of this desirous big other to keep them from closing on to the child. The paternal function is to keep the jaws of mommy's desire from snapping on that little child. And also to stave off anxiety, because as life goes on, this will become a source of anxiety. If the desire of the big other is constantly overwhelming and surrounding the subject in a way that the subject experiences as overwhelming. This is what we worked out in Seminar 10 series. You can check it out there. I'm not going to mess with it here. What we have here importantly, though, is Lacan tracing what he's doing with the logic of fantasy all the way back to this figure of maternal desire at the very inaugural lived experience of the life of the child. He's trying to offer some evidence of the barred other that he thinks is at root a support for the logic of fantasy. And he goes further than that. Here again, I'm just summarizing the discussion that we've had in this lengthy break for those of you who weren't here. He goes further and to say that what this means is that the big other doesn't exist. He's clear about this. Page 92, the other does not exist. And what he means by that is that the big other as we conceive it, as represented in the lower right-hand quadrant of the graph of desire as a capital A with a circle around it, this treasure trove of signifiers that has all the answers and all the words, the dictionary, the absolute book, all the things we talked about last time, doesn't exist. The other is always already barred. From mommies to queens of England. In other words, he says, there is no other. Which in turn puts him right back in the field of fantasy. Because the fundamental fantasy is that in fact, there is a non-barred, non-split, extra-symbolic big other. The fundamental fantasy is that the big other is not barred, not lacking like me, but instead complete, whole, and full. And what Lacan's trying to do is burst that bubble right out of the gates to say, wrong, motherfucker. what you presume to be whole, full, omniscient, omnipotent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, no surprise, God is popping here as well, is in fact just as leaky as you are. And then the question is, what do you do with that horror? According to Lacan on page 92, this is the correct footing that we have to sustain long enough in order to begin. He's just at the start here, in order to begin to talk about the logic of fantasy. So these are fabulous pages. Check them out on your own time, because there's some more technical, heavy lifting stuff that we want to end this lecture with by discussing. One of you beforehand approached me and said, you know, what's up with the stuff happening with repetition, with the act, and with sublimation toward the second part of our readings for today. It just so happens that those are some of the topics that I precisely want to discuss with you. So, and I want to do this through a close reading of some passages. So not much of this is going to be review, but what it is going to do is to put us in touch with the very foundational, according to Lacan, the basic foundational move that psychoanalysis makes around the topic of repetition, and by extension, retroaction. In 14, the fun begins on page 48. And I want to make sure that when I say page 48, you know exactly what we're looking at here, because there is no official English translation of this text. The translation I'm working with is the one from Lacan in Ireland, but be careful, because I've heard there are a couple different ones like that out there. It's the one linked in our Substack through the registration page for this series on Seminar 14. If you go there on page and you turn to page 48, what you see is something that looks like this. So you can compare this, look for those X's, because it's right beneath those X's on page 48 of the translation we're working with, that we want to begin to crack this nut of repetition that is so fundamental to psychoanalytic theory and technique. As you know, in our series on Seminar 11, toward the start where Lacan is defining the unconscious, repetition is a big topic, and it's one that we've addressed fully there, especially around the topic of repression. Notice how it pops up here. The paragraph begins, as you know, I give great importance to this structure insofar as it is fundamental to explain the structure of the unconscious. This will all become clear as we go. In the meantime, bear with me and let's read these passages together from Seminar 14. Namely, that in the moment considered as primary, original, in repression, it is a matter, I say, since this is the mode of presenting it that is proper to me, it is a matter, I say, of an effect of signifying substitution at the origin. When I say at the origin, what is at stake is a logical origin and not anything else. Whenever Lacan talks about a logical origin, think of this as in the Benjaminian sense of origin versus genesis. Origin is something that is retrospectively designated from a moment that at the point of that origin was still to come. Logical time for Lacan is retroactive time. Chronological time deals not with the kairotic moment of meaning making retrospectively, but with the chronos, to use the other Greek term. The chronos of time as it unfolds linearly, the way words in a sentence or notes in a melody unfold. That's not logical time. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that sequential, chronological, highly modern conception of time, which properly speaking didn't really even exist until the 18th century. Lacan is here thinking of a different approach to origins, not origins as point 1 relative to point 3. but in fact, a 0.1 or a 0.0, a ground zero, that at the time of its grounding, of its pointing, knew nothing of the fact. Only afterwards, as the sequence has developed, can you look back retrospectively and see where it began. That's what he means by logical origin. And the way he's representing this is to bring up the topic of repression. Now, if you want to see our model of repression, you can check it on Instagram. It's all over our Substack. It's in our last series. We don't need to rehearse it here, although it might be useful. Let's see if it becomes necessary. Reading on. What is substituted has an effect that the penchants of the tongue, as one might say, in French, can allow us to express immediately in a very lively fashion. The substitute has as effect to subsituate what it substitutes for. To subsituate, to position under. What is found, and don't forget, psychoanalysis, as we discovered in Seminar 11, does not seek, it finds. And every discovery it makes is always a rediscovery. What is found because of this substitution in the position that is believed, that is imagined, that is even made part of the doctrine, very wrongly as it happens, to be effaced is simply subsituated, which is the way that today I will translate, because it seems to me particularly practical, Freud's Unterdrückt, which just means like oppression, suppression, to quell even is another way that you might understand this. This is important here. Logical origins are retroactive. They're not chronological, even though they involve sequential, linear, diachronic unfoldings. They're retroactive in the same way that the repressed is a logical origin of its return, and always the flip side of the same coin. And with that said, I do think it might make sense to just map this out real quick. So we'll go to share screen here. You can see some of the work of the discussion we were just having before the lecture resumed. And we can also now clear the space and do a quick little rundown, a mapping, a topology of Lacan's theory of repression as it is marked by this theory of logical origins, which are going to become very important here. So here we have time unfolding, and then all of a sudden, whoa, some shit occurs. Think trauma, think car crash, think potty training, think whatever the hell you want. There is a primal scene of sorts that causes a blip or a bump or an opening in the logical flowing of time, chronological, of lived experience as it unfolds from one moment to the next. Now, what happens in a moment of trauma, according to Lacan, is that some figure of that trauma gets repressed. And it's not the whole event. It's not every aspect of the potty training experience that was so horrible when you wet your pants beyond what your mom thought you should have been doing and locked you in the bathroom. It would be some aspect of the bathroom. It might be, for instance, the smell of the soap on the counter. That would be the part that you repressed, or the feeling of wet clothing to your skin. That might be the part of the entire event that you would repress. So this is a traumatic event. And you would repress some part of it. In other words, a signifier. The unconscious is structured like a language in part because it's full of signifiers, representations of, in this case, a traumatic event. And these signifiers continue along just as your life continued along until that pool party You know the pool party I'm talking about? The one where your friend thought it would be really hilarious to push you into the water. And damn, the horror of feeling your clothes stuck to your skin. In that moment, the feeling of your clothes stuck to your skin is a symptom. Another signifier that has somehow connected up with the X's, Y's, and Z's of the unconscious. And now you don't just feel wet and embarrassed because you got pushed in, you feel absolutely horrified. Because in fact, if you had ears to hear and eyes to see, you would realize that you feel so horribly because that feeling of being wet after being thrown in the pool is also resonant with and resurrective of the previous trauma of being locked in the bathroom because you wet your pants past the point when your mom thought you should. This return of the repressed is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to reflect retroactively and to come up with some sort of a meaning that explains why you felt so damn awful in that moment. It wasn't just that you were wet and embarrassed. It was more than that. You were extra upset. This retroactive connection is one in which meaning is made. And if you know what I'm talking about here, notice the similarity. This is just the basic elemental graph of desire that Lacan develops in the 1960s, ultimately culminating in the profound, elaborate graph of desire. The same logic is at play here. It's also what you see him doing with language and meaning making in the 50s as well. This same structure permeates a lot of Lacan's thought. And it's one that is also going to give us the button ties that people like to talk about from the 50s. That's here as well. This is a buttoning of meaning synchronically across diachronically disparate moments in time. And we've worked through all this elsewhere, so I'm not going to spend much more time on it. I just want to show you, though, that the origin of your sick feeling here is not exactly chronological. It's more of a logical origin that you would arrive at retroactively via this wormhole of insight that would precisely come up in analysis. In other words, it would be difficult for you to crawl out of that pool feeling wet, disgusted, embarrassed, but also way more than all of that, and immediately be like, this reminds me of, I know why I'm upset. This is like when I got locked in the bathroom after pissing my pants and mommy was upset. You ain't going to have that insight in that moment. You're going to do something crazy. You might grab the other person, throw them in the pool. And who knows, that could be the beginning of the best pool party y'all ever been to. I've been to that pool party too. That's a fun one. This, though, is probably not going to be the moment of insight. The moment of insight is probably going to come later when you're on the couch. In fact, what is more than likely to occur in that moment is you're going to shrug it off, pretend like you're not that upset, laugh about it to hold the embarrassment at bay. In other words, you're just going to get over this speed bump as best you can. Hopefully, you'll come back and be able to make the connection to this earlier primal scene that caused the repression, that allowed for the return of the repressed, and so forth. Because if you don't, just wait until the next time you find some clothing stuck to your skin. That's what happens. If you don't make this pink retroactive synchronic assignment of meaning, you're destined to repeat. A mistake is an experience that hasn't yet transformed into a lesson. The pink arrow here marks the lesson that comes from the accident. If you don't derive a lesson from the accident, you're destined to keep having it. And here, of course, I mean the accident of falling in the pool, and the one that, according to your mom, was the reason you got thrown into the bathroom, which of course is not the reason. She threw you into the bathroom. She herself may have need of a couch. But here's what's popping on 48. What we're getting at here is a theory of retroactive meaning making, and also some way of understanding the relationship between two events. What we're after here is a nascent theory of repetition. Repetition is what we're after here. The return of the repressed is in many ways a repetition of sorts. What kind of repetition that is, we're going to get there. Blast forward in this lovely English translation to page 106. If your 106 looks like my 106, the first words on the page are point and Freud. Page 106 is nice because it gives us a theory of the unconscious as the great object of study in psychoanalysis. And it points us in the direction of repetition, not as an object, but as an operation. The object of psychoanalysis is the unconscious, and it is in very many ways structured as an opening, which I emphasize. And repetition is very much the operation that we see when the unconscious starts firing. I would also add, just to be elusive, it's a repetition in the real. Okay. Top of page 106. Now that you found the passage, the paragraph begins, if Freud retains our interest. If Freud retains our interest, it is not because of what he thought as an individual at one or other detour of his effective life. What interests us is not Freud's thinking. It is the object that he discovered. This object, of course, is the unconscious. Scroll down a little bit more on page 106 of seminar 14. What is research? Nothing other, undoubtedly, than what we can ground as being the radical origin of Freud's approach concerning his object. Nothing else can give it to us than what appears to be the irreducible starting point of the Freudian novelty, namely repetition. So the object is the unconscious, and the starting point for understanding it is a logic and operativity of repetition. Or indeed, this research is itself, in a way, repeated by the question which gives rise to what I will call our relationships. Namely, what is involved in a teaching which supposes that there are subjects for whom the new status of the subject, which the Freudian object implies, is realized. In other words, which supposes that there are analysts. So the Freudian object presumes a whole host of subjects, one of whom is the analyst, namely subjects who can sustain in themselves something which gets as close as possible to this new status of the subject, the one which the existence and the discovery of the Freudian object determines. Subjects who will be the ones who are up to the following. Up to the following. In other words, up to the task, to the challenge that the other, the traditional big other, does not exist, and that nevertheless there is indeed Bedeutung. From Frege's work here, we just mean sense, meaning. Lacan is thinking structure. Fancy German word for sense, meaning, but really what he's working on here, not just the reference to Frege, but he's talking about structure here. An analyst is somebody who is up to the task, to the challenge, in a way that the analysand very rarely is not at the start of analysis, of realizing that the other, the traditional big other, as whole, as complete, as total, doesn't exist. and in fact is barred. Key question here is, what is the structure of the other as barred, as lacking? Now, what we said last time was that it amounts to a container thing contained logic. A container cannot be among its contents. That's what we were working with here. Oh, okay, that's the structural logic of the lack and the other. There is no other of the other because containers cannot be among their own contents. There's no container for the container that purports to contain everything, as the symbolic and the big other do. This Bedeutung, for all those who have followed me enough up to now, that for them the words that I employ, I am saying that I employ, have a sense, this Bedeutung, let it be enough for me to pinpoint it here by something which has no other name than the following: the structure insofar as it is real. So, reviewing what we have here. The analyst's job is to hold in mind what the fundamental fantasy prevents the analysand from having at the start of analysis, which is that the big other, the traditional big other, as whole, complete, total, does not exist. And yet there is still something structural at the level of language, meaning. And this structure is real. And then he's down to the Mobius strip, cut in two, and it's a median cut he has in mind here. Imagine a Mobius strip, and you don't snip it so that the thing comes unfurled. You cut it along its surface in half and see what the results are. When you cut a Mobius strip in half along its median, Lacan is noting here, this is basic like topology here. When you cut it in half, it does not result in division. The Mobius strip does not come apart. It reduplicates. Do it. Make a Mobius strip and make that median cut, and you'll see. Now there's not one loop, but two. One wraparound, so characteristic of the Mobius strip. And then again, Lacan reiterates, the structure is something which is like that. It's real. The structure that Lacan is referring to here, this Bedeutung, is real because it is necessarily excluded from the system of signifiers that it supports, that it instantiates, namely the symbolic. So we're back at that same structural logic of container and thing contained. Whatever is rejected, foreclosed in the field of the symbolic is going to pop up again in the experience of the real. Lacan has been saying this since seminar 3. We just haven't had ears to hear it. The real is an effect structure of the symbolic. It's through the symbolic process of rejection. And I'm like Lacan, I want to use the word foreclosure here. The same thing that would produce psychosis. What is foreclosed in the field of the symbolic is what's going to pop up in our encounters with the real. And what is foreclosed or rejected from the symbolic is the counting mechanism that operates whenever it purports to capture, I don't know, every word in the language. Its totalizing efforts preclude those mechanisms, those operations of totalization, sending them out, and thus casting them into the real. That's partly what Lacan is getting at here. The structure is real because it is ejected from the collection of signifiers at the level of the symbolic that it supports. Which is why I say that this additional one, this one too many, it's not just extimate to, cast out of, but also integrated into the symbolic. It is also the condition of possibility for symbolic. This is the bag that contains all those dicks. This is the box that contains the cereal, jewelry, and the like. The structuring agent that enables the container designates it and also is ejected from it is real for this reason. Lacan then shifts to talking about structural substance, and I'll let you see where he goes with that. The first thing we want to note here is this connection between the unconscious object that Freud discovers and the operation of repetition that is relevant to it. And I'm acutely aware of the fact that we are still looking at the image of repression here. Now, forward a little more to 110. My goal, as you know, is to offer a clear, coherent commentary on this text to help you read it. Page 110 is where it starts getting really good. In order to work with the unconscious, we have to start with a fringe. Top of 110. I am speaking about what is a fringe. There is nevertheless a step to be taken before recognizing in it the trait of the animated, for thinking as we understand it is not animated. It is the effect of the signifier, namely in the last resort, the trace. The fringe, the trace. Let's see what he's up to here. What is called structure is that we follow thinking by its trace and by nothing else, because the trace has always caused thinking. So here again, remember the work we were doing with Lacan's correction to Descartes. Traces cause thoughts, but thoughts as self-conscious, ego-driven enterprises always mask this trace by misrecognizing its relationship to and in it. That's partly what Lacan's getting at here. The relation of this procedure to psychoanalysis can be immediately sensed, provided one can imagine it, or indeed has experience of it. I don't know about sensing this immediately, but we're starting to come close to an imagination of it. Here we go. That Freud, inventing psychoanalysis, is the introduction of a method of detecting a trace of thinking, where thinking itself masks it by recognizing itself differently in it, differently to the way that the trace designates it. And then toward the bottom, the key question here. How does it happen that analytic knowledge comes to pass into the real? Here we have another passage into the real. The path through which what I am teaching passes into the real is none other, bizarrely, than the Verwerfung, rejection, foreclosure, than the effective rejection that we see happening at a certain level of the generation of the position of the psychoanalyst, insofar as it wants to know nothing about what is nevertheless his only and unique knowledge. You've seen this before. If you've seen our lectures on Seminar 3, you know about this subject who wants to know nothing about it. This rejection, this foreclosure, is also the operation that yields psychosis for Lacan. And you can see this in Seminar 3. What is rejected in the symbolic ought to be focused in the subjective field somewhere in order to reappear at a correlative level in the real. There it is again. What is ejected from the symbolic will reappear, and I hesitate to put re in front of appear, in the real. Where? Here, no doubt. What does that mean? It is what touches you here, namely this point, which is the one to which witness is born by what the journalists have already located under the label of, quote, structuralism, and which is nothing other than your interest. The interest that you take in what is said here, an interest which is real. Naturally, among you, there are psychoanalysts. It is already here, a generation of psychoanalysts in which there will be incarnated the correct position of the subject, insofar as it is required by the analytic act. And now, for the person who queued up the question of repetition, act, sublimation, you're starting to get at it. The analytic act is real. And according to Lacan's greatest inheritor, Alain Badiou, this is what separates psychoanalysis from philosophy, in part because there is this act, this event that happens known as psychoanalysis. You actually show up and talk to a motherfucker about stuff. The analytic act is real, which is why psychoanalysis can never be subsumed fully in the discipline of philosophy, no matter how many times Lacan tries to sweep the knees of René Johnny Descartes. When this generation has come to maturity, you will measure the distance traveled by reading the unthinkable things, printed luckily, so that they will be able to bear witness for anyone who knows who to read, and probably how to read, from which it will have been necessary to extract the outline that this realization of analysis requires. I wonder if here on February 15th, 1967, Lacan is indeed imagining November 16th, 2022. But it's a relevant passage because it puts us in correspondence with the real. And that is also what these traces are. Trauma is real, even if it suffers repression only at the level of signification. We were on page 110, and now I want to turn forward one more to 111, the bottom of the page. We're reading the key sections from seminar 14. The paragraph begins, "In truth." Lacan has just been talking about death and life. And what he wants to say here is that life is not the totality of forces that resist death. He wants to say something else. Life is the totality of forces in which there is signified that death will be for life its rail. And then he gives us the paragraph that's relevant for us. Death is the rail of life. I love it. In truth, this would not take us very far, Lacan says at the bottom of page 111. If it were not a matter of something other than the being of life, what we can, in a first approach, call its sense, namely, something that we can read in signs which come from an apparent vital spontaneity, since the subject does not recognize himself in it, but where it is necessary that there should be a subject, since what is in question could not be a simple effect of the ... fallout, as one might say, of the vital bubble which bursts, leaving the place in the state in which one might say, in which it was previously, but of something which everywhere we follow it is formulated not as the simple return, but as a thinking of return, as repetition thinking. Now, I chose to read this paragraph because it gives us some insight in how one might go about engaging in the analytic act, participating in analytic experience through repetition thinking, or you might even say through a thinking of repetition. That's what we're after here. Somehow this is going to connect to what's going on with the logic of fantasy. I don't know that we'll get there in this lecture, but by God, we're going to come as close as possible. This repetition thinking is what Lacan is up to. And you can go forward on page 112, and you get a lot of it there as well. Middle of the page, repetition is not memory. It's something quite different. If we make of repetition the directive principle of a field, insofar as it is properly subjective, we cannot fail to formulate what unites in material, in the style of a copula, the identical and the different. This imposes on us again to this end the use of this unary trait. There's that word again, whose elective function we have recognized in connection with identification. And now Lacan back on the rail he was working on in the first part of the seminar. I will recall what is essential to it in simple terms, having been able to experience that such a simple function appears astonishing in the context of philosophers, or supposed ones, as I recently happen to have had the experience of, and that people found obscure, even opaque, this very simple remark that the unary trait plays the role of symbolic reference point, precisely by excluding that it should be neither similarity nor the difference, which are posited at the principle of differentiation. The unary trait is something that is very difficult to pin down because it eludes logics of difference and similarity. Now, I don't think he needs to go all there just to say what he's trying to say, but it is what he said, and so it's what we're reading here. Next paragraph. I already here sufficiently underlined the use of the one, which is this one that I distinguish from the unifying one, because of being the countable one, is to be able to function, to designate as so much one, such heteroclite objects of thought, as a thought, a veil, or another object that is here within our reach. And since I enumerated three, to count that three. Count to three. Namely, to hold as null, even in their most extreme difference, of a nature to establish their differentiation as something else. Here is what gives us the function of number and everything that is established upon the operation of recurrence. At this point, it's not clear what Lacan is up to. He's got this notion of a unary trait that somehow escapes the counting mechanism and thus allows it to function as this this one, this one too many. And then on page 113, we get the big shift, which is extremely helpful and probably overdue. Were I in the audience at this point, I would probably think it's about fucking time. And that's exactly where he goes, into the field of time. But if we descend, as I might say, into time, and remember, it's not chronological time that we're thinking about here. We're thinking about kairotic, logical, retroactive time. When Lacan says, let's descend into time, he means like, let's think about time in a more rigorous, properly psychoanalytic way, which is what is demanded of you today in order to take up the identificatory scheme of alienation and see how it functions. And in seeing how it functions, how it undergirds the logic of fantasy. We will remark that the basic one of the operation of recurrence is not already there. It is only established from repetition itself. Remember, retroaction is the theory of time we have here. It's only in the process of repetition that the thing that was to be repeated reveals its mark in the system as repeatable and so forth. And you can think about this too in terms of our definition of objet. In order for there to be a single entity on which we can focus, here's that pen again, you have to be able to count to three first. There's the foreground in which the pen appears, there's the background of the white wall, and then there's the minimum irreducible distance, the line that separates the black pen from the white wall. That third element, difficult to count, is objet, the minimum irreducible distance between two entities that allows them to appear distinct. That's also part of the same counting game that Lacan is saying, because in order to have one entity to focus on, you have to first count to three. You might also think about this in terms of castration and that minus feed, and the metaphor that I've been using here of incision. The proof of the incision is not the act of cutting. It's the opening that is left behind. The wound is the testament to the accident. These are the types of thought processes Lacan is hoping that his audience will engage in. And then he's got some bit about the pleasure principle. Forget about it. Middle of the page, 113. A situation which is repeated And here we get into the conceptual heavy stuff. So hang tight. A situation which is repeated as a failure situation, for example, but you can imagine any situation that's repeated, like walking down the same street that you walked down yesterday, implies coordinates not of the greater or lesser tension, referring back to his stuff on the pleasure principle, but of signifying identity of plus or minus as sign of what must be repeated. But here's the catch. This sign was not carried as such by the first situation. In other words, the street that you walked down yesterday and the experience of walking down that street did not carry with it. It was not a signifier of its repetition today when you walk down the same street again. It was not at the time yesterday part of the repetitive process. It's only by walking down the same street again that you take that earlier moment and retroactively draw it into a repetitive operation. It was not part of repetition until you did it a second time. This sign was not carried as such by the first situation. You should clearly understand that this was not marked by the sign of repetition. Otherwise, it would have been the first. Lacan is just himself flabbergasted by that. But it's not. The truth is, walking down the street yesterday comes second to walking down the street today, because it is a retroactively inscribed origin, a logical origin of the repetitive operation of you walking down the same street today. When you walked down the street yesterday, it was not the origin of a repetition, even if you had planned it. That's not how repetition works. Repetition works retroactively, the same way that meaning in psychoanalysis is made. That's why it's relevant here, y'all. Much more, and here he's going to say much more, it must be said that it becomes, and it becomes only retroactively, the repeated situation, and that by that fact, it is lost as the originating situation, that there is something lost by the fact of repetition. You walked down the street yesterday. You had a regular walk. It was no big deal. In the night, there's an earthquake. I live in San Francisco. What are you going to do? There's an earthquake, and the sidewalk is now cracked in a million ways that wasn't there before. Now, suddenly, the experience that you had of walking down this beautifully paved sidewalk yesterday becomes wildly significant. Significant in a totally new way. But note, in this case, that perfectly paved sidewalk is also gone. You didn't know how significant it was in its perfect paving until that shit was completely torn asunder by an earthquake. It's in hindsight that it is experienced, and is experienced notably as something lost. That's why I'm sticking with this example, because it literally illustrates something that is lost. The perfect paving is now cracked and split by the earthquake. The originating situation is determined after the fact. So you see this in psychoanalytic experience as well. The analysand didn't realize how important that particular historical event was in their past until 20 years later, they realized, oh my God, that's why I have trouble when skin and wet fabric come into contact with each other. I didn't realize how significant that primal scene of being locked in the bathroom with my wet jeans was until now, later, after being thrown in the pool and murdering 3 people because I didn't know what was going on. I lost my mind. Wow, I could see now why I was so upset. I speak archly, but trying to make this point here. And this is not alone perfectly articulated in Freud, but he articulated it well before, having been brought to this statement of repetition in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. And then we get to the bit on rediscovery, which is always what it means to track in the unconscious, and on the drives, which also operate on a series of lost objects. And then primal repression There's that Verdrängen. And then down at the bottom of the next paragraph, all of which is constitutive of the subject, namely repetition. Somehow, repetition is also constitutive of the subject, just as it is our lead point into the logic of fantasy. How were we to graph this? Well, take a look at the graph in front of you right now. The graph, as one might say of this function, I think you all have been passing the shape that I gave as an intuitive, imaginative support of this topology of return. For it to solidify the part, this topology of return, which is just as important as its direct effect, as this effect that is itself imaged, namely its retroactive effect, what I called just now what happens when by the effect being repeated, what was to be repeated becomes repeated. Now, don't get too crazy about this. The graph that he is talking about is represented in more detail in the graph of repression here, but it's also here. The basic graph of meaning making and language use for Lacan is the graph that he's referring to here, because it demonstrates a retroactive effect that in turn establishes a repetitive relationship. It's only in the field of the symptom that you can recognize this as a repetition of that. It's only after the fact that repetition can retroactively find its logical origin. This is one of the most fundamental insights of Lacanian psychoanalysis. It's stone cold in his 50s work, and now he's kind of just assuming that people have it. Obviously, he's going to develop it to crazy lengths in the graph of desire, which we've spent a lot of time discussing. Here, he's also assuming that you've got that shit under your belt. Of course, you know the topology of return to which I'm referring. It's worth noting here on the diagrams in front of you what he's working with here. Repetition is part and parcel of the retroactive, resubjectivizing process of analytic technique. That was really Freud's great discovery. These are the pages to consider, I believe, in seminar 14. And it just continues. 114 is a great one here. And he introduces once more the internal 8. The best way to wrap our heads around this is, first of all, to review our series on seminar 11, where in the last couple of lectures, we focused a lot on this internal 8. But it's also worth noting here because, you know what, not everybody could be there. The interior 8 that starts popping up here, you can see the image on page 114. It looks something like this. At the end of seminar 11, this really becomes a significant way of understanding how you can get the drive, how to pass from the field of demand to that of the drive. It's important there, and it's important here, this double loop of, they'd have it translated as the inverted 8, and my understanding is that in Spanish translations of Lacan, it also pops up as the inverted 8. I prefer to think of it as an internal 8, because what it has done is effectively taken the number 8 and flipped the top part into the bottom part. So it's an internalized 8. It's not simply an inverted 8. It's not just an upside down 8. It's an internalized 8 where the top loop has been folded into the bottom. And it's important for what we're up to here for reasons that we still have yet to arrive at. It seems to be the theme in seminar 14. You're working really hard on shit, and it's not entirely clear how this is ever going to get us to the topic of fantasy. But hang on. 114 in this seminar, this double loop, this inverted 8, this internal 8, which is much better, gives this retroactive effect. There it is again. that cannot be detached from it, which forces us to think out the third relation. Here again, a few lines down on page 114. From the one to the two, which constitutes the return, comes back in closing itself. From the one to the two, which constitutes the return, comes back in closing itself. From the one to the two, experiences of reading also sometimes duplicate what it is you're trying to understand. Towards this one, in order to give this non-numeral element that I am calling the additional one. Here it is again. The one too many for the symbolic to handle. The additional one, this un that it is marked by the unary trait, is non-numeral. That's why it's so difficult to count. It neither subscribes to logics of difference or similarity, nor does it succumb to logics of counting. The numeracy of this additional one is tricky, which is why you'll always hear from me that in Lacan and his math, 1 + 1 is going to equal 3. There's something that defies, no matter how much he wants to mathematize psychoanalysis, any proper mathematics of psychoanalysis. At least one that wouldn't be fall under the acronym of fuzzy. This additional one is non-numeral. It is not reducible to the series of natural numbers, neither additionable to nor subtracted from this one and from this two which succeed one another. Still, it deserves the title of this additional one, which I designated as essential for any signifying determination, and which is always already, moreover, not simply to appear, but to be grasped, fleeting, detectable in lived experience. Once the counting, note the French here, subject has to count himself among the others. What is this third relation that we're talking about here? We're at the end of our time today. So what I'm going to do is draw it for you. I want to show you rather than tell you. He's giving us this internal 8, and he's telling us that somehow it's related to this very familiar elemental graph of desire. And what I would suggest is that if you want to understand how he's getting the connection between these two, that you unfold the internal 8 so that it now looks something more like a proper 8. Unfold the bottom loop, open it back up so that you now have a more proper number 8. And then what I would suggest is that you map this onto the elemental graph such that it looks something like this. Here is your primal scene, the same logic of repression and return that we just saw. Here is your symptom. Down here, if you're playing with the graph of desire in its primordial form, here's the subject of pure need, and here's the barred subject. But this movement is essential to understanding the connection between the internal 8 and the elemental graph of desire that models this retroactive move that you also see here. Here's what I'll suggest by way of closure. The primal scene is a 1, but it doesn't come first in the 1-2 punch that is the return of the repressed. Point 2 is represented by the symptom, by the return of the repressed. Number 3, this third relation that is non-numeral, marked by an additional 1, is the retro relationship, represented oftentimes by objet a, an uncountable additional 1 that marks 2 as a repetition of 1, and thus establishes their differential retroactive relation. There's your primal scene. There's your return of the repressed at the level of the symptom. And here is this nebulous third element, usually figured as objet A, here marking a retroactive relationship of repetition that marks the second as a repetition of the first. It doesn't mean the first was part of the repetitive process. It's not until the symptom pops that the primal scene can be seen. And that, in turn, is a third move, a third element, this retroactive, repetitive movement backwards. Repetition does not occur going forwards. It is a retroactive process, which relies not on origins that are chronological, but instead origins that are kairotic, synchronic, logical origins, as Lacan puts it here. Now, what is at stake in all of this talk of repetition around the topic of desire, around the topic of this seminar, fantasy? It comes to us on page 115, which is where we're going to leave off today. On this permanent downfall of the other. And the question that we leave with, the parting question, is this: how do you reconcile what he's doing with the theory of repetition and retroaction with the fundamental fantasy? Namely, that the other is not whole, complete, and full, but in fact, that the other is divided, fragmented, and incomplete, that it is finite, just like us. Page 115 gives us a clue. The double loop that we see being worked out on these graphs in front of you at the level of repetition are connected to Lacan's argument that up to this point has been structural, that the other is always already barred. See what you can make of this between now and our next session. Stay tuned. Thanks for being here. The floor is now open for questions.